Good evening and welcome to 365 Days of Amazing Stories with Theo Mayer. Here we are on day 27 and I'm continuing the story of fire on the mountain, living with fire, or living with wildfire in Big Sur. I left the story off, I believe, after having stayed up all of Saturday night dealing with this fire that had come on to my property. And when I first met it, it was on this saddle. And the saddle was very close to the main road, but then toward the southwest, it descended down to this lower road that made its way to Jerry Forbes's home. And when I first went to see the fire, it was quite intense and really burning through a lot of fuel on the southwest side. You know, the flames were like 8, 12, 15 feet high, burning through manzanita mostly and some chamise. And it had gotten, to a big madrone tree as well, which it ended up killing the upper part of the trees because it burned through the cambium layer, which is very close to the skin of the tree. The madrones, most often, their bark is really like a skin. Anyway, I left that alone because it was just too big and too intense. And I went up to the top where the flames were rather small, and I kept putting it out just by shoveling dirt on top of the flames with a shovel. And I would get really exhausted because I had a fever, and I would lay down. And when you're close to a fire and it's smoky, if you just get down close to the ground, you can almost always find a little patch of fresh air, that's just like the 2, 3, 4 inches off the ground. The air tends to be fresh and breathable. So I would just put my face right down against the ground, and the air was cooler and fresher. I kept working that edge, and the amazing thing is that when that fire was so intense, it burns up the fuel as it's kind of moving uphill. And then it gets to the top, the fire gets to the top where there's no more fuel, and it doesn't have anywhere to continue, especially when a person is up there extinguishing those smaller flames and creating a line of bare mineral soil, which the fire cannot burn through or burn past. An ember can go past it and start a fire again in what hasn't burned. But if it's just a creeping fire and there's not a lot of wind, it's not a big fire, then the chances of that are rather slim. So after this fire had made one of its runs up the hill, I ended up just at the same time walking down and inspecting. And now the fire is almost out. And there's little spots of fire on the end of branches and in the root balls on the hillside where it had just burned up. So I just went down with the shovel and I knocked the burning branches off the manzanita, and I covered the root balls with dirt, and I walked my way down along that edge. Now, between the road to Jerry Forbes's, Jerry and Helen Forbes's, and the main road, there's a fire road that mostly runs on my property. And that fire road acted as a fire barrier as well. It was pretty well maintained, and so the fire again had a hard time jumping across that. So I had these sections of brush to deal with where I needed to put the fire out. After many hours of working, the sky began to get light, not from a fire, but from the dawn approaching. It was 5:30 or 6 in the morning, and I could not believe it because I had made it basically through the night. And I thought, okay, now I might get some help. The world is going to reawaken. People are going to be available, and I'm still alive, and this fire is mostly out. By the time it was getting light, that's the way it was. It was like there was little places to put fire out, but the fire line had been extinguished. You know, it was like the length of a football field, that much, and probably a little bit more. So I just kept going over this line over and over again and just watching any place that looked like it was going to ignite again, and I would put it out. Well, once I saw that most everything was out, I went and got my water trailer with one of my trucks, had 500 gallons of water in it, cranked up the motor. I had a fire hose, 50-foot length of fire hose on it, a nozzle, and I started spraying water on root balls, manzanita root balls, and the chamise root balls that were still burning. And it was amazing. I could dump water on some of these root balls and they just wouldn't go out. The core of the root ball was so dense and so hot that it would have just taken a steady stream of water in order to extinguish it. So some of them I just left smoking. Once I had sprayed enough water in this one area to be pretty confident that fire was not going to spread from it, I again went over the whole area. And in this one section, it was a part of that fire road that went through my property. But there was a little corner of it that was on the Tucker's property. And across this little ravine, there was a wisp of smoke. And it was in a part that really hadn't burned. To get to it, well, I could have, but it would have been climbing through a lot of brush, and it looked pretty difficult. And I wasn't feeling good. And I just thought, I'm probably going to regret this, but I'm just going to leave it. And so I did. I drove the water trailer to wherever I needed to fill it up, which I have a hydrant on the road. I think I probably filled it up there. And then I parked it up by my house, got back in the 4Runner, drove through the entire neighborhood to make sure there was no fire anywhere. And it was just still and quiet, you know, in that early morning time. It was probably now 6:30 or 7. Still quiet, so quiet. Birds weren't singing like they normally did. Everyone was on high alert. Every living creature, all of them, have programmed into their DNA what to do when there's smoke. Everything looked good in the neighborhood. And so I'm driving back, and I decide I'm going to go down the hill a little ways and see what's happening down Long Ridge Road. And I go around a bend. I'm still on my property, but on the main road. And there's 2 or 3 oak limbs that have completely fallen because of the fire. The fire was burning the trees, and the trunks and branches just fell into the road. So I stopped, get out of the car, and suddenly there's a voice that said, "Who is that?" And I look over, I see a couple people kind of through some smoky atmosphere, and I say, "Who's that?" And it ended up being Jake and Cheryl. Cheryl, Mid-Coast Fire Brigade chief. Jake, her husband, assistant to the chief. And Jake came walking over to me. There were branches down. They had stopped their vehicle because they couldn't drive any further. He walked up to me, gave me a big old hug, and told me that they had been so worried about me. because there were a couple of people on the fire brigade who'd been calling me and asking me to come down off the mountain. They were afraid I was going to burn up, with good reason. So he hugged me. I said I was okay. Cheryl came up. I gave her a hug. And I immediately thanked them, because if it had not been for my time on the fire brigade and all the training I'd received, and really the incredible supervision that I received during fires that I showed up to, I would not have had the confidence or the knowledge or the wisdom to deal with the fire that came onto my property. I had learned a lot, so much, and actually been on numerous wildfires and structure fires. So I wasn't really afraid of fire, but I treated it with the greatest respect. We talked a little bit. They told me that if I got those branches out of the road, that they would send up help. And I assured them that I would. They turned around, went down the hill. I immediately positioned my Forerunner. I had some towing straps, and I pulled them to the side of the road, got them out of the way, and then drove further down the road because I still wanted to see what was going on down Long Ridge Road. Well, I drove around the corner to where it kind of opens up toward the west and toward the Pacific Ocean. And my property is up around 2,700 feet. It's pretty high. And it's about 4.5 miles as the crow flies from the Pacific. So that's a lot of elevation gain. Now, I was coming around the corner, went down a little bit, and 2 or 3 telephone poles had burned through and fallen on their side. And the telephone line was in the road. There was still enough room to get by it with my car, but I stopped. I just thought, okay, this is far enough. And as I'm sitting there, Jake and Cheryl came up the hill with my neighbor, Scott Rayner. Now, before that happened, and before I had driven down the hill, I had driven past Scott Rayner's, and I'd seen a bunch of fires around his place. Scott Rayner did an incredible job of protecting his place, cleared brush, and, you know, it was pretty safe. But there were things that were on fire, plastic mostly, that was close to his house. I don't know if they were hoses or what it was. I doubt his house would have started on fire, but it might have. And there was also fire coming across the hillside where there was still some dried grass stubble. And I had spent probably about 45 minutes or an hour. I pulled a hose out from the side of his house and extinguished any possible flames that might be of danger to his house. Anyway, after that, I had gone down the hill. Jake and Cheryl came up with Scott, left him off with me. I drove him up to his house, and he went to deal with his own place. And at about the same time, Waqar, Kadeem, Aaron, Carey, and a guy, Jesse, from Mid-Coast Fire Brigade showed up in one of the smaller wagons, but did have a, 300-gallon water tank on it. Well, we all met together. Scott Rayner was on the fire brigade too, and we divvied up. Aaron came with me. Jesse and Waqar went with Scott to deal with a tree that was on fire that had fallen on one of his buildings. Aaron and I went to deal with another fire that was still on my property. I'm going to leave the story right there, and we'll continue with it tomorrow. Okay, thanks for joining. Have a good rest of your day or evening.